I was 39 in the fall of 2021 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in the woods outside a small town called Halcyon Ridge in Montana. It wasn't some spontaneous adventure. I needed the quiet. My wife, Alara, had taken our Sobin, he was 9 then, to stay with her sister in Spokane. Things between us had been tense for months, nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down that happens when two people stop understanding each other. I told her I'd use the time to clear my head. She didn't argue. I'd been to those woods before. About 15 miles past the last gas station, off a dirt road that barely qualified as one. No cell signal, no cabins, no marked trails, just dense pine and uneven ground that smelled like damp bark and cold earth. It was the kind of place where silence felt physical. I got there a little after noon on a Friday. The sky was gray, but not threatening rain. I parked my truck in a small clearing I'd used before and set up a simple camp. Tent, folding chair, a small propane stove. Nothing complicated. At first, everything felt exactly how I wanted it to. Quiet, still, predictable. I spent the afternoon walking a short distance into the trees, just enough to feel removed but not lost. I recognized certain landmarks, a fallen tree split down the middle, a cluster of rocks that formed a natural ring, familiar enough to keep me grounded. It wasn't until early evening that something shifted. I noticed it while I was heating up a can of soup. The woods had gone quiet, not gradually, just stopped. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to die off all at once, like someone had closed a door on the world. I remember pausing with the spoon halfway to my mouth, listening. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Animals move, patterns change. That's normal. But it didn't feel normal. It felt like everything had left. I forced myself to finish eating, cleaned up, and sat by the edge of the clearing as it got dark. I didn't light a fire. I never do when I'm alone out there, habit from years of camping. By around 9 p.m., the darkness was complete. No moon, heavy cloud cover, the kind of dark where your eyes never fully adjust. That's when I heard the first sound. A single, dull knock. Not loud, not sharp, just a soft, deliberate tap. I turned my head toward the trees immediately. Nothing. I waited. A minute passed, then 2. I almost convinced myself it had been something falling. A branch, maybe. Then it came again. Same tone, same spacing. It wasn't random. It was measured. I stood up slowly, scanning the edge of the clearing. My eyes kept playing tricks on me, turning shadows into shapes that disappeared when I focused. "Hello?" I called out, louder than I intended. No answer. The sound didn't come again for several minutes, long enough that I started to feel ridiculous for reacting at all. Then, from a different direction. That's when the unease really settled in. It wasn't the sound itself. It was the movement. The way it seemed to shift position around me without any footsteps, without any indication of something actually traveling through the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping it across the tree line. Empty. But the beam didn't reach far. The light just dissolved into the dark after a few yards, swallowed by the density of the forest. I told myself I'd go to the tent, sleep it off, and leave in the morning. No point overthinking it. Inside the tent, things felt slightly better. Enclosed. Defined. I zipped it shut, turned off the flashlight, and lay down. For a while, there was nothing. Just the faint sound of my own breathing and the occasional rustle of fabric when I shifted. Then, after what might have been an hour, tap. This time, it was right outside the tent. Close enough that I felt it more than heard it. My entire body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement, just silence pressing in from all sides. I reached slowly for the flashlight and turned it on, aiming it at the tent wall. The thin fabric glowed dimly, but it didn't reveal anything beyond it. I waited, counting seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. Then, a shadow moved across the tent. Not quickly, not like something passing by. It lingered. I could see the outline distort slightly, like whatever was casting it wasn't standing still, but adjusting, leaning. I didn't make a sound. I couldn't. The shape didn't look clearly human, but it was upright, taller than me based on where the shadow reached. My hand tightened around the flashlight. "Who's out there?" I said, my voice low, controlled. No answer. The shadow remained for a few seconds longer. Then it was gone. Not stepping away, not fading, just gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat there back against the tent wall, Flashlight in my hand, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. At first light, I packed everything as fast as I could, barely checking if I left anything behind. I just needed to get out. As I was loading the truck, I noticed something that made me stop. There were footprints in the dirt near the tent, but they didn't lead toward it. They led away. A single set, deep impressions like whoever made them was heavy or pressing down harder than necessary. And they started right next to where my tent had been, not from the trees, not from any direction. Just there. I left immediately. I didn't report it. I didn't tell Alara the full story either. I just said I didn't enjoy the trip and didn't want to go back. But here's the part that still bothers me. About a week later, I was home alone. Alara and Tobin were still in Spokane. I was sitting in the living room late at night when I heard it. Soft, measured, from somewhere inside the house. I was 31 in the summer of 2019, working as a freelance wildlife photographer. Most of my assignments were small, local magazines, conservation groups, but that year I'd started taking longer solo trips to build a proper portfolio. My wife, Corinne, supported it, even though she hated the idea of me going off-grid for days at a time. We didn't have kids yet, just a small apartment in Flagstaff, and a routine that felt steady enough to leave behind for a while. The trip I'm talking about was in a stretch of forest outside a town called Darren Falls in Northern California. It wasn't a national park, just protected land with limited access roads and no official campsites. I'd gotten permission to be there for 4 days, mostly to photograph deer and any nocturnal activity I could catch on camera. The first day was exactly what I expected. I hiked in about 2 miles from where I parked, found a spot near a shallow stream, and set up my tent. The trees there were tall, packed tightly together, their branches cutting off most of the sunlight, even in the afternoon. It kept the ground cool and dim, which I liked. I spent most of that day scouting, marking spots where I could set up motion cameras, checking animal trails, noting where the light broke through the canopy at certain hours. Nothing unusual. That evening, I set up my main camera on a tripod about 30 yards from the tent, angled toward a narrow path that animals seemed to use. I'd done this dozens of times before, leave the camera running, check the footage later. I went to sleep around 10 p.m., exhausted from the hike. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. No sound, no obvious disturbance. Just that sudden, clear awareness that I wasn't asleep anymore. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, but not unnaturally so. I could hear insects, the faint movement of leaves, the distant trickle of water from the stream. Then I noticed something small, the zipper of my tent. It was partially open, only an inch or two, just enough to let in a thin line of darker black from outside. I was certain I had closed it completely. I stared at that gap for a long time, trying to convince myself I'd just forgotten. It happens. You get tired, you miss something simple. Still, I reached over slowly and pulled it shut the rest of the way. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked the area around the tent. No footprints, no signs of animals getting close, nothing disturbed. I almost let it go, but when I checked the camera footage later, something changed. The camera had stopped recording. Not powered off, just stopped. The last timestamp was 2:13 a.m. I scrolled back through the footage leading up to it. For hours, it was just empty path, occasional movement from small animals, nothing out of the ordinary. Then, around 2 for 12, the image shifted slightly. Not like the camera had been bumped, more like the focus adjusted on its own, even though it was set to manual. The path blurred for a second, and in that blur, something passed through the frame. Fast. Too fast to identify. I replayed it multiple times, slowing it down as much as I could on the small screen. Whatever it was, it didn't look like any animal I recognized. The shape was wrong. Too upright, too narrow. After that frame, the recording ended. No error message, no battery issue, just ended. I told myself it was a glitch. Cameras fail, settings get messed up. There's always a technical explanation. Still, I moved the camera closer to the tent that night. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted a clearer shot of whatever had passed through. That second night, I stayed awake longer. Around midnight, I was sitting just inside the tent, camera in my lap, listening to the forest. It felt normal again, almost enough to make me forget about the footage. Then I heard movement. Not close, maybe 50 yards out. Slow, deliberate steps. Not the quick, light pattern of a deer. Heavier. Measured. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint the direction. The steps stopped. A minute passed. Then they started again. Closer this time. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to announce exactly where I was. The steps came closer still. Then they stopped just beyond the tent. I could hear something shifting its weight on the ground. Not pacing, not circling, just standing there. I stayed completely still, my hand tightening around the flashlight. After what felt like several minutes, I made a decision. I turned the light on and pointed it directly at the tent wall. The fabric lit up, but it didn't show anything beyond it. No shadow, no outline, just blank, glowing nylon. But the presence didn't leave. I could still hear it, subtle movement, like something adjusting its stance. Then, without warning, the tent dipped slightly on one side, not collapsing. Just pressed, as if something had leaned against it. I froze. The pressure stayed there for a second, then slowly lifted. No sound of footsteps retreating. No sign of anything moving away. Just the absence of weight. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and pushed my way out of the tent, flashlight sweeping wildly across the trees. Nothing. The forest looked exactly as it had before. Empty. I didn't pack properly. I left the tripod, one of the smaller cameras, even some of my gear. I just ran. I didn't stop until I reached the truck. My lungs burning, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I drove out of there in the dark, barely watching the road. I didn't go back for the equipment. I told Corinne I'd cut the trip short because of bad conditions. She didn't push. A week later, I checked the memory card from the second camera, the one I'd moved closer to the tent. It had recorded everything. Hours of darkness. Then, around 12:47 a.m., something entered the frame. It wasn't clear. The angle was low, and most of it stayed just out of view. But I could see part of it. A shoulder, an arm, too long, hanging lower than it should. It stood there for nearly 6 minutes, perfectly still. Facing the tent. The recording didn't capture it leaving. It was just gone in the next frame. I don't take solo assignments anymore, and I don't set up cameras at night because I still have that footage. And sometimes, when I watch it, I get the feeling it wasn't just looking at the tent. It knew exactly where I was inside. I was 36 when this happened, in late October of 2018, just a week before Halloween. I remember the date clearly because my daughter Emma had just turned 7, and my wife, Claire, had been nagging me to take a few days off. I worked as a regional safety supervisor for a mid-sized logging company based out of Northern Oregon. Most of my job involved checking sites that were too far out for regular oversight, places where corners could be cut and accidents could quietly become statistics. That's how I ended up alone in the woods that week. The site was about 40 miles from the nearest town, tucked behind a series of narrow logging roads that twisted like veins through miles of dense forest. It wasn't unusual for me to go alone. Honestly, I preferred it that way. Less small talk, more focus. I packed my usual gear: boots, flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and a handheld radio that barely worked once you got deep enough. The crew assigned to that section had reported delays, equipment failures mostly. Nothing alarming on paper, but when I arrived, something felt off immediately. Not in a dramatic, movie-like way. Just wrong. The kind of wrong you can't explain, but it sits in your chest like a weight. The machines were there, 2 harvesters and a skidder, but they were shut down, parked in odd angles like they'd been abandoned mid-task. No fresh tracks, no sign of recent activity. The ground was damp from a recent rain, but there were no footprints except my own. I checked the time. Just past 9:30 a.m., I tried calling the crew supervisor on the radio. Nothing but static. At first, I assumed I had the wrong location. It wouldn't be the first time GPS coordinates were off in these woods. But then I found the cut logs. Freshly felled, their pale interiors still exposed. Someone had been working here, recently. I walked deeper into the site, calling out a couple of times. No response. Just the quiet, and I mean real quiet. Not peaceful, not calm. The kind where even your own breathing feels too loud. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something that made me stop. One of the trees, still standing, had a deep gouge near its base. Not from machinery. I've seen plenty of damage from saws and loaders. This was different. Uneven, splintered inward like something had struck it with force, but not cleanly. I crouched down to get a closer look. The wood around the gouge was darkened, almost wet-looking, though it hadn't rained in hours. I reached out and touched it. It was warm. That didn't make sense. Wood doesn't hold heat like that, not in open air. I pulled my hand back instinctively, wiping it on my jeans. I remember feeling irritated more than anything else, like I was overthinking something simple. I stood up and scanned the area again. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't strong, just faint enough to make you question if it was real. A kind of metallic, sour odor. Not quite like blood, not quite like decay. Something in between. I followed it. That was my first mistake. The ground sloped slightly downward, and the trees grew closer together as I moved. Branches hung lower, forcing me to duck occasionally. I kept expecting to find the crew, maybe someone injured, maybe a mechanical issue they couldn't fix. Instead, I found a helmet. It was lying on its side near a fallen log. Standard issue, bright orange, with the company logo on the front. There was a crack along one side, like it had been dropped from a height. I picked it up and turned it over. No blood, no hair caught in the edges, just dirt and that same faint smell. That's when I realized something else. No birds. I hadn't heard a single bird since I got out of the truck. I stood there for a moment, holding that helmet, trying to decide what to do. Training told me to leave and report it. Instinct told me the same thing, but something else, something stubborn and stupid, kept me there. I set the helmet down and kept walking. The smell got stronger. It led me to a small clearing I hadn't seen on the map. The ground there was uneven, churned up like something heavy had been dragged across it. Not machinery, there were no tracks, just disturbed earth, and in the center of it there was a pile of clothing, work jackets, gloves, a pair of boots, all of it piled together like someone had taken it off in a hurry. I didn't touch anything this time, I just stood there staring. That's when I heard it. Not a whisper, not a voice. A sound, low, rhythmic, like breathing. It came from behind me. I turned slowly. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees, shadows, the same dense wall of forest. Then something moved, not fast, not sudden, deliberate. It stepped out from behind a tree about 30 feet away. I've spent years trying to describe what I saw, and I still can't do it cleanly. It looked wrong. Not in the sense of being monstrous or grotesque. It wasn't covered in blood or anything like that. In fact, it was almost ordinary at a glance. Roughly human-sized, standing upright. But the proportions were off. The arms were too long, the shoulders too narrow. Its head tilted slightly to one side, in a way that didn't seem natural, like it wasn't used to holding itself upright. Its skin, if that's what it was, looked tight, stretched over something that didn't quite fit. And it was breathing. That same slow, heavy rhythm I'd heard. We just stood there. I didn't move. It didn't move. I remember thinking about Claire and Emma, about how stupid it was that I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going. Then it took a step forward. That broke whatever spell I was under. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't try to be quiet or careful. I just ran, branches hitting my face, boots slipping on wet ground. I could hear it behind me, not fast but steady. Always that same rhythm. I didn't know how far I ran. It felt like hours, but it could have been more than a few minutes. Eventually, I broke through the tree line back into the main site. I saw the machines, my truck parked beyond them. I kept running. I got in, fumbled with the keys, and started the engine on the second try. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just trees. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I went straight to the nearest ranger station and reported everything. They sent a team out that same day. They didn't find anything. No clothing, no helmet, no disturbed ground, just an empty work site and 2 silent machines. The crew, 5 men, were officially listed as missing. No bodies were ever recovered. I quit that job 2 months later. Claire still doesn't know the full story. I told her it was stress, long hours, easier that way. But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and Emma's asleep, I hear it again, that slow, steady breathing. Not outside, inside my head, like it followed me out of those woods and never really left.